Hi, my name is Katie Ailes, and this is a poem called This is Science. This is science. This. The heel striking ground, followed by ball, then toes. The roll of it. The Sistine arch holding the motion, then the release into the air. That ancient dead gas from the earth, but not of it, with flickers of living things, or life-giving. Who knows the difference? Then, again meeting ground, that seemingly stable mass assumed intractable and finding the give of it. This. Knowing your take, the place that made you, that grew you infinitesimal from cells into a pressure, extending into this space, mattering. To know without transgression, without dissection nor negation, to breathe in this ancient, living gas, and to want to know the difference. I wrote this poem in conjunction with the Experimental Words Project, which is something that Loud Poets and Freddie Alexander have been doing in Edinburgh, coordinated by Dan Simpson and Dr. Sam Illingworth for the past month or so. It's funded in part by the National Environmental Research Council, so thank you to them for that. What we've been doing, it's really exciting. We've been working with scientists from the University of Edinburgh Geosciences department to craft brand new poems and performance pieces. And I think for me as an artist, it's been really, really wonderful because, especially for me as a confessional artist, I so often just write about my own life and use my own experiences as fodder for poetry. But it's been really wonderful to get to talk with these world-class scientists, hear about their research, and then think about how to communicate that through a poem. It's been incredibly inspirational. Where this piece in particular comes from was the first ever exercise that we did when we met with our scientists. Dan and Sam, after introducing everyone, said, right, go off in your teams and write a poem with the title, This is Science. And to be honest, my first impression was, this is going to be terrible. This is going to be so corny. I hate science was my first reaction. I was always really poor at science in school. It didn't come intuitively to me. I did okay in the classes, but only because I could memorize everything, not because I understood it on any real conceptual level. And I got talking with Paul Palmer, who's my scientist. He's a leading climate researcher. And we were talking about our different understandings of science. And one of the major things that came up for me was how I always understood the sciences that felt tangible. So I was never good at physics or chemistry because, you can't see an atom with your naked eye. And, physics, I can understand pressure, but I can never really understand, force and how things worked and friction. I found those equations really difficult. But I loved geosciences because I could understand, this is a rock. I can understand mass and density and weight. And I loved anatomy because as a dancer, that was something that I could really connect with. I understood how my body worked from a real experiential perspective. So when we were talking about what our experiences of science were, the main metaphor that kept coming out to me was that of a walking foot, was that of the body, and how through that one thing you can experience pressure, you can experience force. There's an element of walking on the earth, so responsibility for your gravity, for your give and take and the pressure that you exert. But there's also obviously anatomy and that kind of understanding. And so I found that to be really powerful. The other thing that's in the poem that I feel like when I share the poem I really need to say is that there's a bit of an inaccuracy, or rather a question that I've deliberately built in, and that's the question of how we think about air and whether we think about air as living or dead. And this was a question, one of the first questions that I asked Paul when we were brainstorming our poem, and I was just kind of spitting ideas, and I said, is the air alive? And you could see him just look at me and go, what kind of daft question is that? Of course the air isn't alive. It's not sentient. It's not alive in any kind of way that we think about it. But I think that as poets, it's almost our job to ask these really ridiculous questions just to really get into the minutia of life and go, Well, let's think about this for a second. Obviously, air is not a sentient being, but there's life-giving ingredients in it. And, it comes in part from dead things. Carbon dioxide in part comes from burnt trees, which were alive. Carbon is a major building block of life. And so I found this to be a really interesting question and an interesting thing to think about. I keep returning to the Emily Dickinson quote, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." And I think that that's something that poets can do. We can come at these scientific truths from a really interesting perspective. And I think as well, it's something that scientists and poets have in common. We so often create this binary, right? We go, scientists use the scientific method. It's all about facts and truth, and it is. But then we say poets, it's all dreamy and it's all in the atmosphere. And in some ways it is, but I think often we're using similar methods. We're trying to come at truths in an interesting way. And our jobs, both scientists and poets, are to question facts that we've always assumed are true. For all that we knew, the sun revolved around the earth for millennia until we figured out that we had it wrong. So I think that that's a real commonality, and it's time to kind of break down that binary and go, right, being a scientist is creative and being a poet is in many ways a search for truth.